Hi, Alex Williams, founder of the New Stack, here today for a special edition of the New Stack Analyst. I'm here with Jerry Chen of Greylock Ventures. Hey, Jerry, how are you?
Hey Alex, how are you today?
Very good. And John Edgar of DigitalOcean coming in live from Boston, Massachusetts. How are you?
Good, thanks. Good to be here with you guys.
Yeah, good to be here. So this show today stems from a conversation John and I were having, 2 months ago or so about this whole landscape that we're a part of. We deal with mobile apps all the time. We're on the web all the time. We're on our devices all the time, and increasingly the question is, who do developers develop for? Do they develop for the mobile web or for more native environments? And I think that's a question that will affect a lot of the technology development over the next 5 to 10 years. And so I want to just talk with you guys about it. I know, John, why don't we start with you, because this is something you've been thinking about for a while, and I'm curious on what that thinking, how that thinking has changed and where you are now in terms of just seeing all the app development now, especially with younger people.
Sure. A lot of this actually came about around a year ago. I was spending a lot of time when I first joined DigitalOcean on the college hackathon circuit. Part of that was around trying to understand the future that we should be thinking about around our product, and trying to kind of get a handle for the direction that developers who are coming out of these U.S. colleges were taking in terms of their development. Obviously, software development is just kind of taking over as an industry and is growing massively, which is great for all of us. And it was really interesting. I was spending some time at these college hackathons, and I would be talking to students about what their hacks were and how they were implementing them, and specifically in the context of DigitalOcean and use cases for DigitalOcean. And a really interesting thing kind of came up as a side to that was around their disinterest in building for the web. When you look at these college students, 19, 20, 21, their senior years, UCLA, Berkeley, so on and so forth, they are coming out of school with a really deep computer science knowledge. They're learning Java and C, and they all have these devices in their hands, a lot of them using Android and iPhones. And it was interesting that they felt like they could get a much better experience to market, aka to their friends, quicker with a mobile app than they could building a web app, trying to figure out how to host it, whether or not it's kind of cross-device, whether friends can consume it, and so on and so forth. And also they were able to receive this massive amount of traction really quickly in an app store. So you get it at the app store, the discoverability is really good, so on and so forth. And you just see this massive takeoff. I think Yo was actually a really interesting example of that recently. And the more and more I kind of started to dive into this, the more concerned I got, mostly around the future of the web and around these future developers. When we look at the growth of the developer segment, it's something in the order of 3 billion people today, and it's looking to grow to over 50 billion in the next 3 to 5 years. There's a lot of developers being added to the market, and we think about the technologies that they're adopting and what they want to use. More and more we see that native is kind of the direction that they seem to be going in. The Apple ecosystem is really good. The Android ecosystem is really good. And so, as I said, alarm bells were kind of starting to go off in my head a little bit, partly because, as our company is definitely one that ties into a web application a lot better than a native application. The story is a lot better there. And so the more and more I started looking at it and thinking about developing markets, China, Africa, so on and so forth, we look at the rate of mobile adoption there. It's just trouncing, PC adoption right, left, and center. So that was kind of what set the stage for this thought process around mobile versus web, and kind of the direction that it's going, and the shifts in how we consume and disseminate information.
So Jerry, what's your thought process as you've entered the venture capital world, especially in moving from the enterprise? I mean, even in my experience in the enterprise, covering it, it really became much more of a discussion about mobile app development. And so as much of it's in a discussion and, with young college kids, it also seemed to be much more a focus of the enterprise itself.
Sure. Let's frame this conversation maybe of what we're seeing in trends. There's web, mobile web, native app, because I think there's a spectrum there. Number one, and I think clearly we all see that web on the PC and the client, the fat client, the big client makes sense, but on the mobile device, for sure, the mobile web is sick, if not dying, and native apps is taking off. And we talk about that both from a technology point of view, an ecosystem point of view, like why the companies like Apple and Google with Android really care about that. And then thirdly, we should probably talk about what are the implications for the rest of the ecosystem in terms of search, in terms of the information graph, in terms of applications, and in terms of entrepreneurship, right? What that means when you have a mobile web that pretty much is non-existent and everything's dominated by native apps, because that has pretty profound implications on startups and disruption in the ecosystem. So I completely agree with John that this generation of developers, this generation of users is mobile first, right? Or we used to talk about cloud native or developers born in the cloud. Real quickly, these developers are born mobile. So they're developing mobile first, and the mobile web is pretty much almost non-existent to maybe declining. I haven't seen the latest stats lately, but everything is native app, and for a couple reasons. One, it's the experience is so much better right now. Two, to John's point, distribution channels of using app stores, the Play Store, is so much better than the mobile web in terms of discovery and promotion. People know how to hack the app stores. And three, the large incumbents, namely Google, Android, and Apple, their incentive really is to encourage native apps versus, I think, the mobile web, because all of a sudden they have ability to differentiate with native apps vis-a-vis each other's or third parties. But as a result, a ton of information that is now being stuck behind native apps. And I think it's profound. I think John's comment around developing markets is even more profound, because the English web is pretty much dominates like the most of the knowledge on the web today. But in the emerging markets, they don't have this huge corpus of like Wikipedia articles or websites because they're newer to the internet. It's okay for them to go mobile first and native apps, because you don't care if you can't search everything on the web or can't access the web, because they're starting from kind of the benefits of the second comer. So that can segue to the next topic, what we think the implications are. But for sure, I think mobile first and the generation of mobile first developers is happening because of they're all using their cell phones or tablets. Number two, I think the ecosystem of the large incumbents like Apple and Google are encouraging it. And I think we're at this point where I as an investor, I as a user of the internet am concerned, because all of a sudden now what was really a free and open sharing of data on the web is now getting kind of hidden behind a bunch of native apps. And it doesn't have to be hidden completely. There's ways you can still unearth all this data, but how you interact with their data, how you search, how you use your data via native apps is very different.
Mm-hmm. So with that thinking, in mind, what are you hearing from companies that are coming into your offices to give pitches? Or what are the kind of trends you're seeing in that respect?
I think a couple of trends. First, pretty much like John said and we said before, every end user facing application is mobile first, web second, right? And they're almost, when you say mobile, it's almost a native mobile app. Number one. Number two, when you think about how you think about analyzing or dealing with your mobile app users, is very different than our web users, right? And I mean in a couple of different ways. So your web users sitting in front of a laptop or a PC or a Mac, the browsing and how you even monetize things like ads and impressions is very different. When you're thinking about a mobile app user, there's two things. One, there is some mobile advertising that's largely dominated by Facebook and a couple other of the major properties, but all these small little apps that don't necessarily have the same kind of eyeballs, the way you monetize them is either a paywall, a subscription, or triggers, like event triggers, like because you have location awareness or app awareness, the way you monetize those guys a little bit differently. So we're seeing everyone go mobile first. Second, when you think about the tools to monetize some of these users on web versus native app, things change subtly as well.
John, so what is the impact that it is having on DigitalOcean, for example, and how you guys perceive the market overall.
I mean, I think that generally there's always going to be a need for abstracted infrastructure, so it's not something that we're particularly concerned about as a short-term issue, that's for sure. I think that in the long term, as we see products like Firebase and Parse start to take off, and backend as a service kind of becomes more abstracted for native applications and these tie-ins to the web, so to speak, and distributed networks become just an API call away. Certainly for cloud providers generally, it's going to be an interesting space and certainly some kind of interesting competition, I guess. But generally, I think that at the end of it, we're going to have to evolve as these trends shift, the same as everyone else is. And because we're not really focused on the enterprise space and more on the individual developer space, we're pretty well equipped and nimble enough to do that. But generally, I mean, it's definitely something that we have our eye on, especially with the kind of trend from people using, consuming their information on a desktop computer traditionally to more of us using an iPhone or a cell phone of some description.
Okay. So if you guys, in comparing, for instance, the mobile web to the native web and the hybrid native, I was looking at, I was doing a little research, and one group, Celerity, they break it down this way. They say the mobile web runs in the mobile web browser. Works on any device. It's built with HTML and JavaScript and CSS. It's served by a web server. No approvals or app stores are needed. It can look a lot like native. It may be responsive or target specific screen sizes. A native, it runs as a locally installed app built with Objective-C and or Java and or C#, installed on the device, fed by APIs, approval and app store needed, built for specific device screens. And then the hybrid is what I'm curious about. The run is a locally installed app built with HTML5 and JavaScript and CSS, installed on the device, embedded web browser, fed by APIs, approval and app stores needed, built for specific devices, platform compilers. And so it's that hybrid one that I'm curious about because, I mean, there was, for instance, news that Google had at Chrome I/O earlier this year, and they were trying to blur the lines between web and native apps on on the Android, so I'm curious on Jerry, on that take. Is the hybrid app is that the future, or is that kind of just like a bastard version of what really is most attractive for the end user?
I think hybrid is one of two things. One is an evolutionary step towards hopefully a mobile web that can keep up or match the performance and the usability of a native app. So I think as HTML5 and other standards mature, hybrid apps get a lot more usable as a substitute for native apps. Or two, hybrid apps are a productivity hack in terms of it's faster for a web developer to get a mobile app up and then to use some kind of wrappers or some SDKs to connect to the functionality of the native device that you want. So either A, it's hybrid because the web standards aren't quite up to snuff yet, so you have to surround that HTML5 or mobile development with other tools or libraries. Or B, it's a product for a lot of apps where you don't need to use the full functionality of the accelerometer, the camera, etc. Then it's a quick way to get your app out. We're basically doing mostly in like HTML5 or whatever standards, wrapping around. It can do web and mobile web hybrid at the same time. So I think it depends upon the app you're trying to build. And I think for a lot of apps, the hybrid makes sense. It's easier to maintain, faster. But I think ultimately what we like to see is in one school of campus either A, mobile web catches up to native, or B, the tooling just gets really good, so it's almost indistinguishable between the two.
This blurring of the lines, John, is that is that something you've been thinking about, and how, and kind of that what might be the, the middle ground here, or is it just something that's just so like just really, a matter of, of the individual kind of use cases?
I have a lot of hope for the web and the mobile web generally, because I think that it has the potential to do more for us. I think Jerry made some really great points around kind of these walled gardens of app stores and kind of controlling the information and so on and so forth. I mean, the web has always been just that for us, the ability to kind of send information out there freely without censorship and so on and so forth. And I think that part of the problem that we have with the web is basically the lack of standards is alarming. W3 is a bit of a joke, to be honest. The browsers, there's no good kind of standardization. We kind of fight for it across the board, but it's not very good. People are hacking around, browser APIs all the time. There's not a lot of good APIs through to a lot of the hardware on devices yet. And so there's kind of all these things that are really hedged against the web kind of being the future of how we consume application. I really hope that it's at the application layer because, like I said, I think that's a much better way for us to disseminate information and consume application. But right now, certainly, I have yet to meet a hybrid experience that I really think is very good. I think Famous, the front-end framework, did a really good job of showing us what that could be like. It has a very native feel to it. They're able to get really fast frames per second. But because of the lack of organization at the web, I think that we haven't come kind of together as this group of web makers and said, well, this is a good way to develop applications for the application layer. This is how we want to see it standardized across browsers. This is how we want to deliver code through and render it through a browser on a multitude of devices. And so as a result, we've kind of ended up, with broken browsers all over the place, broken mobile-first websites all over the place. And there hasn't really been good education around kind of a mobile-first mentality for the web, not taking websites and shrinking them down, but understanding what it means to start with the device and move it up to the desktop, thinking about the trends of how we're kind of consuming code.
Yeah, that whole issue, almost about the information architecture itself, and trying to kind of define the experience in that way, is a complicated one when people do come from these different kinds of backgrounds. If they do come from the web background, they're gonna be designing it a lot differently. They're gonna be trying to use the browser in a different way. Do you see this kind of like this patchwork landscape, Jerry, out there that John is talking about?
Yeah, patchwork. So let's talk about that. I mean, my partner John Lilly spends a lot of time looking at some of these mobile technologies, and he used to be CEO of Mozilla, right? So he's actually very knowledgeable, very deep in around kind of information and access, open access on the internet. I think right now there are small patchworks, but let's take a step back. If you look at the App Store, most of the top-selling mobile apps, or a lot of them are games, some productivity tools. So I think, if you're a game player on your device, you don't worry about patchworks or isolations of knowledge walls right now. I just more worry about the future that, as this generation of developers come up and start developing native apps, and you have these kind of walled gardens, what happens, right? On the web right now, you can link to other websites. The information is a lot more accessible, a lot easier to use, and people are habituated to doing that. Web developers are habituated to be, that kind of free and sharing links and referencing other data on the web. Native apps on the mobile side, that doesn't really hold as true, right? It's all of a sudden I care about my app, and the data I'm actually using is very different than you, Alex, or you. So I think we're early innings of this kind of app dev ecosystem. I just want to make sure that bad habits don't get integrated with this generation of developers.
Like, what are some of those bad habits that you've been seeing? Specifically, Jerry.
Oh, just how you think about sharing information, accessing information, right? If it's if it's a walled garden, like John said, then sharing information, accessing information between apps is a second priority versus I think something that's natural on the web, right? Because you have, and quite frankly, with all the search engines that kind of index all the websites, it's kind of very accessible to everyone to see what's out there versus now on native apps it becomes a lot harder, right?
Mm-hmm. So, in that respect, is there this need for this sea shift in the browser? Does this mark a change in in the whole browser landscape and how it's defined and its future? Especially if it's if it's as fragmented as John is saying.
I don't know if fixing the browser is the right way to fix this problem. It might be, right? It very well might be. And to John's point earlier, standards and stuff out there are kind of a mess now, so I wouldn't necessarily count on the browser ecosystem to solve it. Maybe that's the right area, maybe it comes from someplace else. And I think if you're a betting person, you would probably bet that this gets solved someplace else outside the browser. My guess, but who knows?
I think you can see that in terms of kind of like underlying technologies, don't you? For instance, we're seeing more. We're seeing the devices being more powerful themselves, being able to cache the data. So, for instance, there could be offline access inside of these subway systems, and inside of subways, for example. John, is from your perspective, is it those infrastructure technologies, the databases and such that will make the difference more so than the browser itself?
Certainly, local databases are getting a lot better. Ultimately, that code has to be rendered into something, and right now, we're rendering all of our web code in a browser, obviously, or a headless browser on the desktop. So, like Jerry, I'm not entirely sure that the browser is what's going to solve this problem. Certainly, if you look at Apple versus Google, which is obviously the kind of great native versus web titans, if you will, we see some interesting pushback from Apple around their reluctance to implement some standards like WebRTC into Safari. I mean, they've come to the table now kind of reluctantly because of the adoption that it's had, but obviously, it cannibalizes a lot of their native applications. It cannibalizes FaceTime, and these are things that they obviously want to own. They want to own the data around it. They want to own the statistics around it. They want to own that ecosystem. And then if you look at Google, their bread and butter, their money is made on understanding our usage and serving us adverts to the application layer using Gmail and stuff like that. And they kind of seem to have one foot in the door with Android and one foot in the door with the web. Certainly, we talked to Paul Irish on the Google Chrome web tools team. They're definitely working towards helping developers kind of understand how to kind of interact with the operating system, how to interact with these native applications a lot more. But I don't think that the browser is really what's going to fix this or what's going to allow us to kind of push the web forward. Generally, I wish that personally the web developers and applications developers were just a little more organized, and that they had the ability to come together a little bit more and say, well, this is the direction that we're going in, and these are the things that we want to see progress. These are the standards that we want to work on. These are the ways that we want code that lives at the application layer of the internet to interact with, native hardware, different devices, and so on and so forth. It's difficult to know what that will look like. And right now, we're using web languages that are pretty old, and then we have Apple come along and introduce something like Swift, and you're just like, well, okay. I mean, that's a natural progression for all of these college students that I referred to earlier who are learning C and Java. it's easy for them just to get into Swift and get native applications up and running. And we're lacking something like that at the application layer. Right now, JavaScript with kind of its handy helpers and frameworks and toolkits is kind of the closest thing that we're getting to be able to just kind of manipulate the DOM in a way that makes it feel like native. But it's certainly not even close to being there. It's still hard to get things under 60 frames per second. It's still hard to get things to feel native. There's all these hurdles that we have to overcome with, as soon as you lose your connection and so on and so forth. So we have a long way to go. And like Jerry said, I'm not sure that necessarily the browser is the thing that we should be looking at.
Jerry, so we see a lot of discussions about open source. For example, Docker is just is a perfect example of the open source story and how it really kind of does define the conversations. And then so these whole issues of standards and such are almost like a paradox to that open source movement, isn't it? And so, how do you create this? Is there some uniformity that you see emerging that is helping kind of define the space to some extent that standards used to do?
No, I think.
And is that going to be a determiner of the direction for mobile web versus native?
No, okay, so let's unpack that. There's kind of two questions. One is kind of open source and open source management evolution projects, and then how is that going to be the right way to evolve tools on mobile web versus native apps? So I would say, open source works really well in general because you have the collaboration of the community working towards a single goal. I think it works poorly when you have multiple interests trying to pull a project one way or another. So I think in the early days of most open source projects, you end up having a de facto standard that's open source, and then as it gets enough momentum, you become more of an organized standards body around it to make sure it's well governed, well maintained, and not one party kind of hijacks entire processes, right? So I think we can talk about other open source projects out there that try to put too much rigor too early, and that basically stifle innovation. So I think the early days you kind of want what right now is a petri dish or something of different things to evolve, and then as the right winners of these de facto standards come up, then I think agree on standards, agree on objectives makes sense to make sure there's good governance around these things.
So now, how does the container space? How do you see the container space evolving kind of in that respect? Then?
Well, I think we're still early days, right? So I think Docker as an open source project is one, the de facto standard of containers in the cloud. I think, it's still early days, and then there's a whole bunch of moving parts around it from networking, storage, management, security, etc. And you can see that right now. It's kind of fun, it's this Cambrian explosion of projects around Docker, right? And I think if you look on GitHub or follow on Twitter, there's a bunch of new projects every other day, and I think it's pretty cool. And just like the bad evolutionary Cambrian explosion analogy is used, a bunch of these projects will grow up and some will succeed, and a lot will fall off. But I think to put too much structure on all these projects early is the wrong answer, in my opinion, right? I would rather let creativity foster, and then eventually I think there'll be momentum coalescing around the ones that merit the most attention. So I still think that Docker is early days and early innings, very promising. I think Docker is one kind of the core standard of the container, and I think what's entertaining for me as an investor and a board member of Docker is watching all the things around the Docker ecosystem grow up. And then applying kind of that evolution to the mobile web, I think John and I are both in agreement that there's a bunch of standards and a bunch of technologies that need to catch up in terms of languages and tools, for sure. Makes sense. It's early days, and I think what we'd like to see, me personally like to see right now, is I think there'll be a lot of innovation, probably in the open source community, around the mobile web that will improve that set of tools, improve the set of standards, and then eventually, a couple of these projects probably get a lot of momentum behind it, and then we hope to see that grow up into what the other kind of web standards are today. But it's early days, which is the point of saying that I don't necessarily think it's going to come from the browser standards because they're pretty far along in their maturity. So it's going to probably come from someplace else that has less structure around it, so there could be a lot more experimentation. And I think we're going to see a lot of that in the next few years.
So John, what's coalescing? Well, what are you seeing that's coalescing out there when you talk to developers? We're talking about these new, these very new movements such as Docker, right? And that's gained immense popularity with developers of all stripes. But I don't know how much that relates to kind of this discussion we have, really. Maybe microservices does to some extent. But do you have any thoughts on what you do actually see coalescing, kind of, when you have conversations with developers out there?
Unfortunately not. Certainly not as much as I'd like to see. Docker is certainly an interesting use case in that it kind of it is so applicable to the whole stack, and actually almost Jerry probably has a better answer than I do around this, but maybe has a less actually interesting native story than it does for a web story. But in terms of native versus web, certainly one of the use cases that I see around Docker and the web and kind of the coalescing is certainly the ability to just kind of pick up the front end and move it around, right? So you just kind of put your front end in a Docker container. You have this portability across cloud platforms, so on and so forth. And I think that that's been really interesting for front-end developers, but unfortunately there hasn't been as much coalescing as we'd like to see just generally across the landscape.
It seems like that there's some real drawbacks though to the native app world, in particular in terms of discoverability. Do you see any? Is that a defining factor? Do you think?
Well, before Google came along and before kind of even Alta Vista, we used to say the same thing about the web, right? Oh my God, there's all these web pages out there. How are we supposed to find anything? And so certainly, Apple is a very smart company, and obviously, they're some of the main drivers in pushing this, to my mind, pushing this native kind of world forward, and I think that they're going to definitely come out with some solutions around that, and kind of how we publicly address applications and how we're able to search for them and so on and so forth. But I based on the 90s, I would be very reluctant to say that searchability is going to be something that's going to be an issue in 3 to 5 years, because I've made the mistake of going down that road before and said that we'll never be able to index all the websites on the internet. We've come pretty close to understanding the web as a whole, so I don't think discoverability is going to be an issue in the future. I'm pretty optimistic on them being able to solve that problem. Jerry probably has a good perspective on that.
Yeah, I mean, there's two things, like discoverability of apps and discoverability of the data behind it. I think they're related. Right. So I think discoverability of apps, the reason why Apple especially pushes native is because with the App Store, they control distribution, right? They not 100%, but they help control just discoverability and distribution with their App Store. And how many app developers do you have complaining about the Apple App Store approval process, right? I mean, you hear that it's this kind of selection of the cardinals or something like that, or the Pope. It's like it's this process that they go through. So I think it gives the large channel guys, and Apple in particular, a lot of power in the app world. And then to the point around discoverability of all the data behind it, I'm optimistic like John that I think eventually it'll get solved. Right now, I am concerned that a lot of the data could be siloed or fragmented, like we were talking about earlier. But what is the knowledge finds a way to be free and accessible. So I'm optimistic that a solution will be found. And there's not a good one today, but I think in general the pressure out there for knowledge to be free and accessible. And I think we've seen that time and time again. And so I'm optimistic that something will occur in the space.
It's certainly going to be interesting for news publications, people like the Wall Street Journal, the New York Times, so on and so forth. I think that obviously what we've seen in the last year is definitely that our news organizations are still really, really adamant about making sure that information lives free, and the the web definitely has a better story for that right now, and I think that we would definitely see a bit of a pushback from our publishing industries, specifically around the news industry, if it got to the point where they weren't able to, or they weren't feeling like they were able to continue to disseminate the information that they need to kind of give in the way that they can do with the web. So, I think that
there's an interesting discussion I think that you could have out of that, especially because if you think about the whole issues about surveillance and how they're becoming just so prevalent in the way that people think, in the way that people increasingly will increasingly the way people will think about the web, I think, is terms of how well is it protected, how well is it, how much, how open is it, and how open is it, should it be? Those seem like those kind of larger society factors will seem to have a big impact on the way that this conversation develops. Jerry, do you have any thoughts on that?
So yeah, one, I think in general the pressure to keep information accessible will have something to say. But harking back to a comment I think John made a long time ago about the emerging markets, I think if you think about all the mobile users out there, most are going to be in China and India and outside the U.S. And so I think we're going to have a situation where today most of the information on the web is in English and in this great country. And I think in 15, 20 years from now, a lot of the information that we'll want to access will be in other languages, other countries. We will want to have access to that, either the apps or the knowledge. And to the extent that they're stranded behind a native app experience, will be at a detriment. So I think the pressure beyond from around the globe to make information accessible. But I think the international aspect is super interesting. The fact that China, India, and developed markets that have way more mobile users than the U.S. and also more aggressive users. I mean, that is their primary way of getting to the internet and getting to information is the smartphone in those countries. And so I track that more than anything else.
So, do you have any thoughts on that kind of topic, John, about the impacts of the larger trends in society, such as there's so much discussion about security now and how that might affect the direction or the way we think about the web. And it seems to me it's a lot about kind of, because the last part of the conversation I want to get into is about the whole kind of the topic of data and data accessibility and how data can be used inside apps, but those larger issues that we see kind of facing us, where we're always kind of under this feeling like increasingly of this microscope, be it by corporate or government interests.
Sure. So one of the things that I think is really kind of prudent to consider around the web is that the technology is quite antiquated generally. So when we look at, Google has a great security team right now that's just like going through a lot of the kind of open things that we rely on, security protocols that we rely on the internet right now, and looking through them and looking for vulnerabilities, because there's a lot there. I mean, we've seen over the last 6 months, it's been a pretty rough 6 months for the web generally. And I think that we're going to see a lot more of that coming. It's certainly just the beginning of what we're going to experience, and certainly, from the consumer standpoint, I mean, a lot of people, I would say the vast majority of people have no idea how the internet works generally. They don't know. I asked an air hostess on a Delta flight a couple days ago, coming up to Harvard to give a talk this week, and she asked what I was talking about to the internet. She's like, I call that the magic box because I have no idea what the heck is happening. And so, from an app to the web, they don't really know. And native applications, they tend, I'm very hesitant, I throw caution to the wind that say this, they tend to have a little bit more kind of security around the protocols, or maybe the same protocols, it's all a little bit more baked. And, Apple seems to have a lot more control around what it puts in the app stores, applications tend to be less secure. I mean, of course, obviously it depends on where the developer is putting the data on the end, if it's on their cloud thing or where the actual data is living. Snapchat can get hacked just as easily. But certainly consumers tend to, I think, feel right now like the native world is a little bit more secure, and obviously consumer perception is everything moving forward. You know, the internet is broken is a thing that we hear from Fox News and CNN a lot right now, and I think that's going to have a very detrimental effect on the brand of the internet moving forward, especially as I think that we're probably going to see more stuff come out over the next 6 months around the web.
You don't sound very optimistic, John. I have to say about the web.
From web evangelist, I certainly don't do a very good job of evangelizing. but to be fair, I mean, I think that this is, I think that there are not a lot of people sounding the alarm bells on this. This is something that Chris Dixon wrote a lot about. Benedict Evans, obviously from A16, talks about it all the time. And one of the things that really scared me, I think, a couple of weeks ago, on top of everything that I've already been feeling, was I was having a conversation with a couple of developers from DigitalOcean around the iPhone 6, and they're like, well, is it really that good? I mean, should I really be upgrading to the iPhone 6? And I was thinking about it, and then one of my colleagues said, the iPhone 6 is the first device that I've ever used that feels like a computer. And when I started, it feels like a computer.
Mm-hmm.
And when I kind of started getting in, thinking about that, using my iPhone 6, I was like, yeah, he's right. This feels more like a computer in my hands than anything ever has as a kind of mobile device. And so what does that mean for me moving forward, right? The apps are a lot better. So, sorry, tangent is a great question, but
I personally think, for instance, I'm here on a MacBook Air. I'm wondering how many more, laptops I'll ever own, right? And like I'm starting to look at the iPhone 6 for purposes of video, right? And as as the new stack starts to do more video, how can we do without investing in like a very expensive camera? Could we just buy, an iPhone 6 and start using that? And I think as these devices just get more and more powerful, it's not going to make sense for for me to have a computer like where I sit at right now. But then but Jerry, are you as pessimistic as as John, and maybe and like how do you see your own personal kind of use develop? Kind of like what I was talking about.
I don't think John's pessimistic. I think he's just it's a trade-off. It's a trade-off. So the point around security, I think what John's pointing out is, look, you can echo other things in society that, the open free web comes with a cost, right? To the fact that it's open and people can do what they want with it, there's also more vulnerabilities and potential other things, the cost of that openness. And then when you have a very curated environment like the App Store, you could argue that if you trust the guys who approve the App Store, that it's going to be a lot more secure and better, but at the cost for it being proprietary libraries and native apps. I mean, it's a trade-off, and ideally you like to see a world where some of the open source and open standards and open mobile web is very secure, and maybe it'll get better over time. But it's a trade-off, right? Because by definition, being open, you invite more people into the party or something. So I don't think it's pessimistic. I think, in my mind, I think John's pointing out the trade-off that he's seeing on that security topic you're talking about. And then the second topic you talked about, like, would this device feel like a computer or not? And yeah, I think it feels like a computer, but I think we're going to see a generation of people that won't say it feels like my computer because they'll never own a computer, right? To the point where we were talking earlier in China and India, where the first way they interact with the internet is through a smartphone or a tablet or phablet, whatever. They're going to say, hey, this MacBook Air, it's just like a giant, tablet with a keyboard, plugged in or something like that. And it changes how we think about accessing information, changes about how we think about communicating and how we think about documents. So, it's like Microsoft Word was built for when we did long-form documents, right? Big, complicated, fancy printing. when was the last time anyone on this call opened up Word for a complicated document? Not really. Then it was email for short form. Now it's like 140 characters at most. It was how I communicate to like the two of you. And so
text messaging versus
yeah.
all the coding that almost that goes with that.
Yeah, we could talk about like broader impacts on how it communicated, or the next generation, but people will all rethink work here, and it could be a voice interface, right? And I think that's the next conversation. Talk about if you think beyond mobile, and to like have everything wired to to the internet, like your house, your car, whatever. Is voice, gestures? Is it like wearables? What happens then? So I think mobile's a big paradigm shift from PCs, and I think pretty quickly what's going to be fun for all of us is seeing kind of the what happens next. What's that new way to interact with the internet? Be it your car or voice, and I think or things you put on your face, and what happens. So maybe mobile goes open, mobile web, and also you still have native apps on the next thing, like your watch or something else. Who knows?
Well, that's where and I've got about 5-10 minutes before I gotta jump. But I think the last kind of topic I'd like to think about is data and the accessibility of data and how this applies to kind of these the mobile web and the native app experience, and and a lot of it a lot of the data can be accessed through API. But what happens when we're starting to see the emergence of these more passive applications, right? Like Google Now, for example, that that tells you how far you have to go before you find your next favorite place where you can get a good coffee, or or how long it's going to take you to get on your bike from point A to point B, and for that kind of metaphor to extend, it's going to have to be to the point where it's like, the door will open, right? Or, you'll be able to unlock the door with your phone, which we're already starting to see happen and such, And so, but that's going to increasingly kind of extend into, into the device, into kind of everyday life, into our, into, anything you can possibly think of. So John, does this debate become somewhat meaningless in that respect, or is that just kind of a continued kind of extension of what the web will be and what what mobile will be? Now it's a crystal ball, right? But I'm just curious on your perspectives on that.
Well, I certainly wholeheartedly agree with Jerry. I think that when we see how amazing the adoption of mobile was, and how absolutely just like so swift we adopted that compared to so many other technologies that we've adopted over the last 100 years, the adoption of wearables and the Internet of Things is going to come even swifter when it comes. I think that it's going to, before we know it, we're going to be in a world of sensors and everything's kind of collecting everything. I'm not entirely sure exactly what that means for the web generally, because right now there isn't a good story around how the web ties into a lot of these devices to collect the data. So we don't have like a great story around accelerometer and sensors, and it's getting better, but it's not as good as it should be. Whereas obviously, native applications have this kind of plug-in streams, those kind of sensors, and so on and so forth. And certainly the wearables of the future, I think, are going to be much more geared towards a native world. In terms of data generally, I think one of the shifts that we're going to see certainly is towards data as a currency. I was at the A16 Tech Summit last week, and one of the things that the head of product, or the chief of products for Facebook, was saying was that they really want to move to this kind of data as a currency model where, if I opt in to give my data as a reward, I will receive back some, premium feature or something like that. And so I certainly think that's the direction that we're going in data. And I think that definitely one of the problems we have right now is a very uninformed public about what's being done with their data, how their data is being stored, how their data is being used, and so on and so forth. And that's a huge issue. Our mainstream media is not doing us any favors with trying to educate people around that. I don't think I have any good insights on on really what that means for the web, other than I think that as we consume both web and native applications moving forward, we're going to see more tie-ins to data as a currency, and having more control over, if I give you this, what am I getting in return for it? You know, what insight are you garnering that is going to bring value add to my life? And I want that to be more implicit. I want that to be more prescriptive. I want to understand it a little bit more. I think we have a generation that's coming up behind us that is a generation that doesn't really think or care about those things, and that's certainly something that I'm concerned about.
Jerry, any thoughts in conclusion here on that topic?
I'm with John. I mean, I think the optimist in me would like to see that in the future we will be given tools to kind of curate and manage our data. And I think what's going to happen is you see laws like in Europe, the whole forget me laws being passed where Google has to like erase searches and stuff and information on you. I think pretty soon laws like that become prohibitively costly for vendors to enforce or to maintain, right? You just can't have these one-offs like erase my entire history in the web. So I think what's going to happen as a result is hopefully in some kind of open standard or some project, the ability for us to control or opt into how our data is being used or shared. Again, I'm not sure how that looks. I think I ideally like to see that in me, that optimist in me would like to see that happen, but again, it's going to take a lot more education agreement. There's a lot of battles to be fought there. So I think, look, in conclusion, we talked about some interesting things. Say, one, the kind of a battle around mobile web and how that grows up. I think, two, how we think about data on the mobile web and the web in general, how that grows over time. And I think both would be fun to watch over the next few years.
Yeah, those are interesting topics. Fun for us. Well, guys, thank you very much for taking some time to talk with me today on the NewStack Analyst Show. My name is Alex Williams, founder of the NewStack, here with Jerry Chen. Thank you very much for joining us. Jerry with Greylock, and John Egger of DigitalOcean. Thank you guys very much.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, Alex. Thanks, Jerry.
Bye.
Bye-bye.
Talk to you later, friends.